Hello and welcome to today's presentation, The Fear That Public Speaking... Hello and welcome to today's presentation, The Fear of Public Speaking, the anxiety that this gives rise to, they say in over 75 of people that have to get up in front of a group and speak. Some people put this as the greatest fear of all the fears on their list. It's difficult to take seriously. You would imagine maybe that jumping into a cage with a white shark would come first. But jokes aside, it's a very powerful fear. When I was young, I had to get up at recitals and I had to play my cello in front of teachers, people from the conservatory, people that came visiting, my parents. And I can remember to this day my heart pounding and the intense emotions and my hands trembling to such an extent that I could barely grab the bow when I was walking into the room. And I imagine that my performance suffered considerably as a result of it. So why is it that we have such a fear of getting up in front of a group of people? Well, we fear being judged, we feel not being up to the level, falling short of the mark, being considered not competitive compared to our environment and other people. The actual phobia is called glossophobia, from the Greek term glossa, which means tongue, and phobia, which means, of course, a fear or dread. A dread that you can't control, and this is the important thing. It's not enough just to rationalize and say, it'll be all right, you know. It takes hold of you, like in successive waves, and it can go all the way to a panic attack if you let it really get hold of you. So it's an important subject, and it's an interesting one to explore. So what are the typical... I just did one myself. I slightly stuttered. So stuttering, your heart pounds, sweating, feeling butterflies in your stomach, freezing, not knowing what to say, having a hole in your memory, anxiety, and as I say, it can go all the way to a full-blown panic attack, which can happen to a performer, or a speaker, or people, or an actor. So for the majority of people, it's a very difficult thing to get up, unless your name is Bill Clinton and you just have an absolutely knack for it, or a second nature. So why could this be? Well, there's a genetic theory which is very interesting, and that is that when in the past, let's say at the time of cavemans, just to be very approximative, when people lived in small groups, well, your group meant your very survival, and particularly if you weren't the strongest person in the group, the worst thing that could possibly happen is to be judged or possibly excluded from the group, because this would be a certain death sentence. So there were very clear hierarchies that were established within this type of structure at those times historically, in tribal times, shall we say, where each person knew their place, like dogs in the alpha theory. And people spoke as little as possible to avoid arguments and to avoid falling foul of the people that could exclude them from the group. And it's interesting that there's a very well-known example that American Indians, or indigenous Indians to use the correct term, they were reputed for speaking very little. And you find that people that live in survival type of conditions tend not to be given to idle banter, and for very good reason. So another example which is very interesting, a little bit chilling, is the babies of Laplanders who live up in the Arctic, and they strap their babies to the back of reindeers, and in sub-freezing conditions, they're constantly on the move, looking and scavenging for food. Well, these babies are amongst the few babies in the world that never cry. Anthropologists have researched this. And when you think about it, you don't have to be Einstein to realize that those babies, even when they're very young, realize that if they make a fuss and cry, they might become somewhat of a burden. So, another interesting point is that people's smiles, anthropologists tell us, they evolved basically from when people met each other. They used to go like animals or dogs to try to scare each other as a protective device. But little by little this became a social custom, and smiling is now seen to be an act of submission, or it's slightly submissive because you're trying to please the other person. So again, pleasing other people is very central to our culture and our nonverbal communication, as well as our verbal communications. And when we get up in front of people, it's hardwired into our brain, this fight or flight. Now, we'd like maybe just to get off the podium and run, but when we have to face that fear, we're fighting our biology. And because we know, at least that's the way we were programmed genetically, that it was a question of survival. And in today's society, we're not going to be excluded from the group necessarily, although in certain situations it could occur. For example, somebody that's a political activist in a very repressive regime, they could say the wrong thing and they could end up in jail. So there is still this fear, but it has an impact on our job, the way the opposite sex perceives us, the way we're received, the recognition, the gratitude, or the lack thereof that we receive from society. So speaking in front of others remains something which is very, very important. Now, when you get up to speak in front of other people, what typically happens? You start feeling your heart pounding before you get up, and you go through a whole series of symptoms before you get up. And then often when you're actually standing there, you start coming down a little bit, if you're lucky. If you're unlucky, you have to fight against it during your presentation until, hopefully, the command of the subjects takes over. So, another thing that can be noted is, unlike most other animal species and the rest of mammals, the human infant is dependent not for months or weeks, but for years on its parents. So when a child is very small, it realizes instinctively that it's completely dependent for its survival on its parents, and that if any manifestation that it might make, it runs a very great risk of alienating the parents. So it has to keep its response within certain measures, and that's a difficult task for a young infant, and it creates a lot of anxiety. So when you get up in front of others, as people do at school, for example, on their first day of school, or when they have to get up at school, children can be incredibly harsh, very cruel, and very judgmental. If you don't have as much money, you don't have the same clothes, you come from a different ethnicity, there are all kinds of reasons, or you have a name which is a little different, or curly hair, or a different color hair. Children can be very judgmental, and all of us probably have some scars from when we were children. Were we the last one chosen for a team? Did somebody point our fingers at us? Were we excluded from the group of the people that were hip and that were in? Did we feel unappreciated? Well, some children go to desperate measures, and because they don't feel appreciated, they feel that negative attention is better than no attention at all. And we're all familiar with people that get into drugs and perhaps crime, or dress gothic, or get multiple piercings, or create some type of drama, because the desire to be accepted is so strong that we prefer attention rather than no attention at all. And that's a pretty interesting point. So this fear comes from deep, deep down inside us, this fear of rejection. Where does it come from? As I said, it comes from a fear of abandonment. Whether it's on a professional level, whether it's on a personal level, it's generally advised not to talk about polemic subjects such as money, such as religion. Why? Because this can generate arguments. And arguments, again, can lead to disapproval. People criticizing you, people not liking you. There are people that they call people pleasers that will go to tremendous lengths to always try to please people, to always be pleasant, to do favors, to curry favors, to run and fetch, do all kinds of things. Why, you can ask themselves, are they caught in this dynamic? Well, simply because they're maybe a little bit neurotic and they have this terrific fear of rejection. Think of the lengths that people go to try to be well seen or approved by others in terms of clothes, dress, fashion, trying to excel at a sport, having an expensive watch, looking fit, being tanned. And it's not only a question of attracting the opposite sex, it's a question, again, deep down of being accepted. Some people names drop. Other people, there are all kinds of, some people have Ferraris, other people wax lyrical intellectually, wink wink. But it's all a way of attracting attention. So, although this is not the point of this particular video, there are a couple of tips that can help when it comes to public speaking. The first thing is to understand that all the members of the audience, almost without exception, actually want you to succeed. When they sit down, they identify with you, if you're not too pretentious, and they like, because they can imagine themselves being in their place, and they like you seeing a good presentation. So imagine that these people are your friends or are very supportive. That's one thing that can be very helpful. An experiment in social psychology actually demonstrated that a very super slick speaker got up and gave like a perfect allocution, was very well dressed, somebody that conformed to the norms of what was supposed to be considered good looking in the society. And he got a fairly okay rating, but it wasn't excellent. But when that same person gave exactly the same speech in front of a different audience, but spilled his coffee before coming in and stuttered once or twice, all of a sudden his ratings went through the roof. Why? Because it's very important that the audience be able to identify with you. So another point is speak to the audience's listening. Be aware of who's in the audience, the nationality, the different cultures, the age, the sex, the professional categories, and speak in terms which they can understand and relate to. This is extremely important. Some politicians who perhaps tend to be a little bit narcissistic, which means they overcompensate maybe for a childhood wound by being full of themselves basically. They love to speak and get up, and it's just an absolute pleasure for them to hear their own voices in front of other people. But these people are relatively rare, and the common of mortals really has a difficult time in doing it, and it's something that has to be learnt. Now, for sure, if you practice your speech over and over again, you can get to the point where it becomes almost automatic, and even if you're a little bit scared, then you can kind of call on a reflex action, and this is what a lot of people do. Some people take a shot of whiskey. That's not the most advisable strategy. But again, remember that it's all up to you. If you feel confident, if you know your subject matter, and if you relate to the audience, understanding they have empathy, you should be fine, and each time you do it, you should do better and better. So enough talk from me. It's up to you next time you have the opportunity to get up in front of people. Grab the opportunity and pierce through your fears, and all the best. Thank you.